Okay, let's get started. So, yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Wilkinson. I think I've met a few of you before, and I'm the Wilder Communities team leader at Devon Wildlife Trust. And within the Wilder Communities team, we have Hetty Lewis, who is here tonight, and she's doing behind the scenes tech, and she works across Devon. For the Wilder Communities team. And we also have Emily Perriman, who has a focus in Exeter for the Next Door Nature project. The Wilder Communities team have organised these winter webinar series focusing on topics to empower community action for nature. And the topics have been put together based on the conversations that we've been having with people across Devon. So it's like the popular topics, if you like, that keep coming up. So we really hope that they'll be useful. But we do welcome any feedback and also any ideas for future events that you would like to see as well. Future sessions include focus on improving churchyards for wildlife. That's in January. Then in February, we have improving school grounds. And then in March, we have wildlife gardening. All the details and how to book can be found on our website, devonwildlifetrust.org. So this one tonight is our second event in our winter webinar series, and this evening we're going to be looking at fundraising in your community. But before we get into that, I just wanted to have a very quick introduction to the Wilder Communities team. I know some of you may have already met us, but just to say that the Wilder Communities team has been set up to support community-led action. And what does that mean? So we're basically here to support and empower people like yourselves to take action for nature where you live, where you learn, or where you work. Basically because you know your communities the best, you know the area where you live, learn or work the best, so you're in the best position to kind of identify opportunities where you could do things for nature and wildlife, and we're here to support that. So if you're thinking of, say, running a big event like a wildlife festival, or if you are thinking about sowing wildflowers in your local park, or doing a BioBlitz and anything else in between, we're basically here to support you with that. And this webinar series is one way that the Wilder Communities team is hopefully supporting you and giving you information and help. So other ways or other things that we can offer you are resources. We also can arrange online meetings with you or face-to-face meetings with you to discuss your ideas and see how we can support you. And hopefully next year in 23, we're hoping to do a bit more around training and putting on some training sessions for you. But basically we aim to develop all of these things in response to what your needs are and to what you want. So feedback is really important to us. So if you've got any ideas or think there's something we could be doing for you, then let us know. I'll be sharing our contact details at the end of the session. On top of this, one of the important things that we want to do is to share and celebrate what you're doing, so that others can see the positive impact you're having and therefore inspire others to follow suit and then do the same in their communities, which we then share and celebrate. And hopefully there's a cycle that goes on, and hopefully a snowball effects happens. We really want everyone to kind of see all the great work that is happening across Devon and to inspire as many people as possible. The more people that are taking action for wildlife and nature, the better for people and wildlife going forward. And actually we have a goal at Devon Wildlife Trust to have 1/4 of the population of Devon actively engaged with wildlife and taking action where they live, work or learn. And and this can only really be achieved if we all work together and help one another out. So why take action? I've just put on 3 reasons. So why taking action for nature is good for you. One is, it's great for you. It's great for your physical and mental well-being. It obviously helps nature and wildlife thrive where you live, and so creates a better environment in which you live. And when you come together with your community, you can make friends and have fun, and also, other things like, learning new skills or sharing your own skills with people. And whatever project you choose to do in your community, there will always be an element of resources needed, whether that's time, volunteering your time, or getting other people to volunteer their time, or lending your expertise and skills, or again asking other people to lend their expertise and skills. Or it can be physical, tangible things like tools or equipment that you might need to run your project. And that's where fundraising comes in. In order for you to kind of realize your dreams, if you like, for your community, funds are really important, and fundraising enables you to do the things that you want to do in your community. And tonight we have Amanda Strelger, our grants and major giving manager at Devon Wildlife Trust. And she's sharing her top tips on how to get the funding you need for your community and nature focused projects. Amanda's got a wealth of experience of fundraising in the charity sector, and she joined DWT after many years with the Deaf Academy and has worked as an independent fundraising consultant as well. And she's raised millions of pounds for charities and community projects. So she knows a thing or two about getting funds and getting the money that you need for your projects. After Amanda, we'll hear from Ian from the Friends of Shillingford Wood, and they'll be sharing their experience of successful fundraising in their community, and we hope that will inspire you. First, though, I have a poll question for you, which is going to pop up on your screen. So the question is, what is your current situation with funding grants? So you've previously applied for a funding grant and been successful. You've previously applied for a funding grant and not been successful. I'm currently applying or thinking about applying for funding, or I've never applied for a funding grant. I'll just give you a moment for that to rack up. Excellent. So there's around about 6 people in the room, so about 50% that have previously applied. 1 person has previously applied and been unsuccessful. 4 people are currently applying or thinking about applying, and another 4 have never applied for funding grants. So really varied experience, actually. Thank you for that. That's really good to know. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and Amanda, it's over to you.
Thanks, Katie. I will just try and share my screen. There, so I hope everyone can see that okay. Just going to rearrange my screen a bit so that I can see my slides. So, thank you for joining this evening. It's great to see you all here. As Katie said, I've been working in fundraising for some time, and in addition to the roles Katie mentioned, I've also sat on a couple of grant funding panels for very small grant making trusts. So I hope I can share a bit of that experience with you this evening as well. So tonight I'll cover a little bit about other funding sources, companies and community fundraising, but the majority of the talk will focus on grant fundraising, just because that's the area of expertise I've worked in the most, and I think it's probably an area that communities are potentially less familiar with in terms of fundraising. Then we'll cover a little bit about remembering to thank your funders, because if you do get a successful funding, it's really important to look after your funders, keep them updated, and hope that they may be able to support you again. And as Katie said, we'll have question and answers at the end of both of this evening's presentations. So just to begin with, I'll cover corporate fundraising really quickly. So corporate fundraising, or fundraising from companies. So larger companies, and particularly supermarkets, if you've got any of those near your community project, often have funding schemes. So it's worth getting in touch with them if you've got a supermarket near to you. Places like Asda, Morrison's, Tesco's all have community or grant donation schemes. So do get in touch with them if you've got a local store. It can sometimes be difficult to track down the community contact, and they're often people who are working on the shop floor as well, but it is worth persisting if you can, because they'll be able to help you with your application or let you know if your project is something they could support. Or alternatively, they might be able to donate items for raffles or other events you're running. So again, always worth making contact with your local stores if you've got ones near to your community. And then local businesses or smaller companies near to you might be able to support in other ways. They might be interested in sponsoring an event or something that's visible in your community. So often corporates would want to be able to put their logo somewhere. Could you put your logo in a newsletter, for example, or promote their business in other ways so they can show that they're supporting community events? Or again, they might be able to donate either their services or products in kind, depending on the type of business. So just have a think about people you might know in your local community who might be able to help your project and support in different ways. And then I was just going to touch really briefly on community fundraising. I think most of us are really familiar with fundraising events, open days, auctions, charity raffles, bake sales, all of those things we really enjoy getting involved with. So those are all great. And I'd encourage you to do those. And if you are looking at applying for grant funding, they can be a really good way to show that there is community support for your project and that you have been doing some of your own fundraising yourself, and you're not just going to a funder and asking them to fund all your costs for everything. So do get involved with those. But the one thing I just wanted to flag up that there is a code of fundraising practice. And I've put the link in the slides, so when it's shared after the event, you'll be able to follow that up. But do just check those, because there are all sorts of random things sometimes that you might not be aware of. So if you're running a raffle, you need to sell tickets within one venue, within one evening, or otherwise you might have to register your raffle as a lottery. So those kinds of things can catch people out. So just have a quick look at the guidelines and make sure that any events you're doing fall within those guidelines. So moving on to grant fundraising, which, as I said, will be the main topic I cover this evening. To begin with, I just thought it'd be useful to cover a few of the things you might need to have in place before you apply for grant funding. So your organisation will probably have some kind of founding documents, whether you're a committee and you've got some terms of reference, or if you might have a constitution. If you're a registered charity, you'd have a registered charity number and your kind of date you were established. So however you're set up, it's useful to have your founding documents to hand, because you might have to provide information to a funder on your kind of governance and setup of your organisation. Bank account details. Generally a funder will need you to have a bank account in the name of the organisation that funds can go through. They won't be able to put it through an individual on the committee, so you will need a bank account set up. Policies and processes. Quite often funders don't ask to see these at the point when you apply, but you might have to tick to say that you've got them, and a funder may very well come back to you if you're successful in getting a grant and ask to see those kinds of documents. So again, just worth making sure you've got all those basics in place before you start applying for funding. And safeguarding is obviously really important if you're working with children and vulnerable adults, so definitely worth making sure you've got all that in place first. You'll need some kind of outline of your organisation and your project. So why was your organisation set up? What are you aiming to do? Who's involved in managing the organisation, and what relevant skills and experience do they have? Funders, again, want to be clear that you've got the skills and resources you need to deliver your project. And then again, a short outline of your project, simply what you're planning to do and how you plan to achieve it. A time frame. So sorry, I've skipped the summary of community involvement. So again, it's really good to show funders that you've got community involvement and support for your project. So if you've got numbers of people who volunteer with you regularly, or number of people who've come to your events, then do have those kinds of figures to hand, because it's great to show funders the support you've got within the local community. A time frame for your budget. It doesn't have to be super specific, but you probably want a rough idea of when you're planning to start your project and how long you think it will take to deliver your project. Or if you're applying for general running costs for your project, then you'd want to be able to say, what those funds will be used for, how long those funds will last, and then what you plan to do when that funding runs out. So I'll cover that a bit more later in terms of how you can show a funder that you've got plans in place for beyond the funding of the project. And you'll need a budget as well. So you'll need an idea of how much, if it's a project, how much a project will cost, and how much funding you've got in place already. As I mentioned before, funders do like to see that you have a bit of funding in place already if possible. So anything you can raise towards your project before putting in a grant application is great. Although not always. If it's a smaller grant and it's a kind of setup grant, then you don't always need to have other match funding, but it's worth being aware of. So, sorry, move on to the next slide. And again, I just thought it'd be useful to cover quickly ways you could find funding to apply for. So, first of all, look out for your Wilder Communities newsletters. Going to hand across to Hetty to launch our second poll of the evening. Hetty would like to know if anybody has looked at the Wilder Communities webpage, where there are lists of funding opportunities on there. There we go. You should all be able to see that now. So if you could complete that. So have you visited Devon Wildlife Trust's webpage that provides information on external community funding grants? So yes, I've looked and applied for a grant I found through the webpage. Yes, I have looked and plan to apply. Yes, I have looked for research and interest only. No, I was aware of the webpage but haven't looked yet. Or no, I was not aware of the webpage. Just give you a moment to fill that in. So it looks like most people either weren't aware of the webpage or haven't looked yet, but a few people have looked, which is good to see. Great. Thank you, Hetty. So do look at that page if you haven't already, because there are already some grant funding opportunities on that website that might be useful for your project. A few other ideas: speak to other groups who are running similar projects to yours. So if you know of people in neighbouring communities who are doing similar projects, it's really worth speaking to them, finding out how they've funded their project. And you'll hear a bit later from Ian about how they funded their project. So hopefully that will be helpful to you as well. There are quite a few funding bulletins available. And again, I've listed some of those here and linked to them. So when this is shared after the presentation, you'll be able to look at those. Devon Community Foundation, Devon County Council have free funding bulletins, and the GRIN website, I think that stands for Grants and Resources Information Network. They're a Devon-based organisation, really lovely people who run it, and it only costs £15 a year to sign up, which I think even for small community organisations is quite affordable for most groups. And they send out a funding bulletin every day during the week, which has 2 or 3 grant opportunities on it every day, which is amazing. So obviously not all of those will be relevant to you, but they provide a really good summary at the top of each bulletin, so you can quickly have a look and see if anything on that one might be of interest. Although again, our team at Devon Wildlife Trust regularly check those, so we would forward any of interest onto Katie and her team to go in the newsletters. So hopefully you'll be getting some of that already, but if you're really keen to find funding sources, you might want to sign up yourself. Your local council for voluntary service might have a funding bulletin as well, so if you've got a council voluntary service in your area, it's worth getting in touch with them and seeing if you could be on their newsletter list if you're not already. Your local councillors are also a really good starting point. They often have pots of funding available for community projects. Again, they're usually quite small grants, but they can again be really helpful for just showing community support and council support for your projects. So when you apply for a grant, if you can show you've got support of your local councillor, that can be really helpful. And then the final one here on the Charity Commission website, this is really an advanced search, so I wouldn't recommend most of you go down this route and start interrogating the Charity Commission website, but if any of you are particularly keen to seek out niche funding opportunities, you can go to the Charity Commission website and do an advanced search, and that will allow you to search by charities that give grants to other organisations. So make sure you tick that box, because otherwise you'll get hundreds and hundreds of responses come up when you do a search. But you can also filter that by area as well, so you'll be able to search by Devon and organisations that give grants. So that will still give you a very long list. So as I said, only if you're really keen would I go down this route, but you should be able to quite quickly look through those and scratch off any that aren't suitable, but you might find a few funders through that route if you're very keen. So if you're looking at applying for grants, it's really, really important, and it might sound really simple, but it's really, really important to check the criteria. They often have a lot of guidelines or reasons that you can't apply. So do check those first, because it can save you a lot of time in the long run of going to funders and trying to get grants when they're just not going to be able to fund you. So things to look out for, you know, what type of organisation are you? Will they fund a constituted community group, or do you need to be a registered charity? Will they fund a community interest company? Do you have to have a certain level of turnover before they fund you, or is your turnover too high to be eligible for a grant? All those kinds of things can be worth looking at. And is your project eligible? Do you meet all the essential criteria? And again, I wouldn't try and bend the guidelines when you're looking at a funding application, because funders will be getting lots and lots and lots of applications, and they will need to filter through those. So if your project doesn't meet the criteria, they'll just take it off their list. So it's really worth your time to do a bit of homework first. And then other eligibility things that might come up are the geography. So are you in an area that they'll fund? Are the types of beneficiaries, you're working with, the types of beneficiaries they want to fund, and do you meet the outcomes they're looking to fund? So do a bit of research first, and then do a little bit more research. Dig a little bit deeper is what I would generally recommend. If available, I would always look at what projects a grant funder has funded previously. Have a look and see if they funded projects that are similar to yours. See what size of grants they normally give. So I've just included a little image here on this slide of Devon Community Foundation. So on their website, they have a section called Stories, and on there they list charities they're working with and who've received funding. Some might have a news web page where they list projects that have been funded, or they might post on social media. If they don't have a website, it's also again worth going back to the Charity Commission register and looking up their annual accounts, because quite often grant funding bodies will provide a list of people they've given grants to in their annual accounts. And again, you can look and see who they've funded, potentially what type of project, although they often just list an organisation, and you can see what size of grant they normally give. So it just gives you a real flavour of what might be achievable for your project and where you might fit in that. So yes, just see, and again, think if they tend to fund 1 or 2 projects a year, then how likely is it that your application will be successful? Whereas if they fund lots of projects and they've already funded lots of projects in Devon, for example, then you're probably going to have a higher chance of success. So focus your resources on the ones that look most promising for your project. And again, if there's a contact number or email address for further information, do get in touch. It's always really worth contacting a funder in advance of applying if they allow you to do so. Some funders don't, but if you can, it's a really good idea to do that. But I would say if you are going to contact a charity, don't ask them questions to answers that are readily available on their website. So if they've published criteria and information on their website or through other guidance, don't ask them to repeat those answers. You need to kind of show that you've done your homework, but then think of a couple of other questions that are relevant to your project that you can ask them specifically about. And you might want to clarify the application process and when you might expect to hear a decision, those kinds of things. But yeah, do make sure you're not just asking them to tell you information they've already published. And as I said before, only apply if your project seems like a good fit and you meet all of the criteria for applying. So on to the top tips. I think this is how Katie built the session. So if you're doing a funding application, again, some of these tips sound really obvious, but they're really, really important if you're doing funding applications. So keep it simple and use plain English is really, really my top tip. So from sitting on grant panels and when you're faced with a whole stack of applications, you don't want to be reading through reams and reams of text and loads of jargon and lots of information. You really want to see a really clear, well set out application where you can easily tell what the project is about, what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, and then how the funds will be spent to help you achieve it. So I would always say, imagine you're describing your project to a friend who doesn't know anything about the organisation or your project. And remember that the person who's reviewing your application is unlikely to know about your organisation or your project. So unless there's somebody you know who's very local to your community, they probably won't know what you're up to. But you don't need to address that by sending them a really fancy application with lots of complicated words and trying to impress them. You just need to clearly communicate what your project's about and what you're trying to achieve. And I think I probably mentioned this earlier, but you need to give them confidence that you have the skills to deliver your project, or that the funding you're applying for will mean that you are able to bring in the skills and resources you need to deliver your project. So yeah, it's really about giving them confidence. You have a plan, you know what you're doing, and you just need a bit of help to be able to do that. So top tip 2 is to make sure you answer the questions. Again, it sounds a bit obvious and it always takes me back to days of exams at school where all your teachers say, answer the question, but it's really so true of a funding application. And it can be so easy to just get in the zone and want to tell somebody everything about your project, but just make sure you're really clearly answering the questions that are being asked on the application form. And make sure your budget adds up. And again, that sounds really, really obvious, but certainly from my experience of sitting on a panel, quite often budgets don't add up. And I think there's often a risk if you've done your budget in a spreadsheet, but then you've transferred your figures into a Word document or whatever the application is in, it's really easy to not quite transfer those numbers correctly. So just take a step back and have another look at your budget within the application and make sure it's clear and adds up. And I really have to reiterate that point today because I myself wrote a budget I asked somebody else to check today, and there was a whole section of my spreadsheet that wasn't totaling properly, and so my budget was completely wrong. So I'm very glad I asked somebody to check that for me before I sent it off. So always worth getting somebody else to take a second look and make sure that your budget's adding up. So completing a funding application, top tips, part 2. So this is really about how you go about filling in your application, and I would suggest quite often there are limited word counts, and that can be really frustrating, especially when you want to tell everyone how amazing your project is. But don't be afraid to, as I said before, write simply, use bullet points to get across your key information. It doesn't need to be a long, wordy, posh application. It just needs to be really clear. And if the word counts are there, it's because the funder doesn't want too much information. So just be really precise with what you're saying. If you're doing an online application form, I'd recommend you prepare your responses offline. So use something like a Word document. So pop all the questions in there and then you can work through them, which is often a lot less stressful because you're not worried you're going to lose your internet connection. And some forms do let you save responses and go back, but others don't, and you have to do it all in one go. So prepare your responses offline. That then enables you to share your responses with other colleagues and you can all help edit and review that together. It also means you can do a spell check and check your word counts and things using your Word document. So I'd really recommend you do that if you're doing an online application. Keep a checklist. So quite often funders will want you to send additional documents, perhaps your annual accounts, or they might want other background information that they've asked for. They might want you to send a separate budget spreadsheet. So just keep a list of everything they've asked for so that when you actually come to send your application, you can make sure you tick those off and you've included everything, which often these days is via an email. Lots of funders accept applications by email these days, but sometimes it has to still go by post with multiple copies. So again, just check what they've asked for and make sure you do what they've asked for. And similar to the budget, always ask somebody to read through your application before you send it. Ideally, someone who doesn't know your project, because they could pick up on things that may not be clear. Again, when you know a project really well, it's easy to think someone will understand what you're saying, but always ask someone else to have a read through. Does it make sense? And if possible, give them a bit of an outline of what the funder likes to fund and support, and then they'll be able to see if that comes through clearly in your application. So completing a funding proposal, I've just put this slide in as a separate one to if you're filling in an application form. Sometimes funders do just ask you to submit a proposal and they don't really give any guidelines in terms of what they want you to put in your proposal or how long your proposal should be. So again, these are just a few tips that I would suggest, but you do have more freedom within a proposal to be creative and in how you present your project. So again, don't be afraid to be creative and catch the eye of your funder when they've got that big pile of documents to go through. An eye-catching document can go a long way. So use clear headings to structure your documents. Make it really clear how your project fits with the funder's objectives. And I think sometimes there's a bit of temptation to just send an existing document that you've got to explain your project, which can be fine sometimes, and you might want to put together a document that could be suitable for multiple funders if you're planning to do lots of applications. But always, always, always tailor that document to your specific funder's objectives. So for community wildlife type projects, you could be applying to a specific funder who wants to see benefits for wildlife, and how are you connecting nature and what are you doing locally around that? In which case you'd put the kind of nature benefits first and foremost in your proposal. Whereas if you are applying to a funder who wants to see benefits for the community and people's health and well-being, your project's probably going to deliver both of those, but bring the health and well-being benefits higher. Talk a bit more about those benefits for people who are coming along. You know, how many people are you expecting to come along? How will it impact their health and well-being? What do you think the longer term outcomes will be? So just always make sure you check back against the funder's objectives and make sure you've covered what's important to them. Generally, I would advise including 1 or 2 photographs if you've got the freedom to do a proposal, because a picture really can bring your project to life and show what you're all about. And if there's no guidance on document length, really is quite difficult to advise what you should do. But as a general rule, I'd say if you're applying for a grant that's up to £5,000, 1 to 2 sides of A4 should be plenty. And if it's over £5,000, then up to 4 sides of A4 generally. If it's a really big grant, I would expect the funder to have published some guidelines and criteria about what they'd want to see in a proposal and your proposal length. But again, as a guide, even one of the biggest funders in the UK could give out enormous grants, say even for their biggest grants, no more than 12 sides. So you really should never be needing to go more than 12 sides, I would say. And if you're really unsure, then if they've got a phone number or an email address, then pick up the phone and ask them what they'd like to see. And you might again want to include a covering letter or email if it's appropriate, depending on how you're putting in the application. And again, I've just left this slide in. I won't talk through this in too much detail, but I'll leave this slide in so that you can come back to it and look at it. I've just put in an example structure of how you might want to lay out a proposal if you were to be doing a proposal where there's no specific application questions. And I will cover the outputs and activities and outcomes in a bit more detail on the next slide. So, outputs and outcomes are something funders quite often ask for in a funding application, and people can get a bit confused by the terminology and what the different words mean. So, in general, I would say an output is something that's directly achieved as a result of your project, and an outcome is more about the impact of what you've done as part of your project. So I've given an example here of if you say we're creating some community ponds in a local community garden, nice little wildlife project. So the activities within that could, for example, and I've just pulled these off the top of my head, not based on any specific project, but it could be that you then need to recruit some volunteers to help you dig the ponds. You would do the pond digging work. You might decide you want to plant the ponds with plants that are particularly beneficial to insects and pollinators. And then your output from that project would simply be that you've created 2 ponds within your community garden. So you've done your activities. The result of that directly is that you've created the 2 ponds. And then the outcomes would be around the difference that that's going to make. And again, I would split the benefits here into the benefits that you've got directly for wildlife and the benefits for people. And again, depending on whether your funder is more interested in wildlife or people, or they may be interested in both, which is great, you would kind of change around which ones you give most emphasis to. But outcomes, for example, could be enhanced benefits for wildlife, insects and pollinators in the community garden. And then in terms of people benefits, you would have kind of a really direct outcome of 5 volunteers who've been engaged, feel a sense of pride and ownership in the community garden. They've made a difference, and they've been really involved in that project. But then you might have a broader outcome of 100 people who regularly visit your community garden will benefit from the improved environment in the garden. They'll have a better connection to nature. They'll be seeing more wildlife in the garden, and they'll also have an improved sense of well-being. So it's really just about thinking through the broader impacts of your work beyond the direct things that you've done as part of the project. So I hope that's a bit clearer. Another example could be that you're sending a group of volunteers on a training course to learn about wildlife identification, and then your output would be, say, 10 volunteers have learned new skills and are able to identify butterflies or whatever the course might have been focused on. But then your outcomes would be that you've got a trained group of volunteers who can regularly monitor wildlife in your area. And then as a result of that, the broader outcomes could be that you're able to tweak your conservation activity based on the results of the monitoring. So I hope that helps to think through a bit more of your outputs and outcomes for your projects. Just a quick word of warning there, it's really good to include numbers in terms of your outputs. So if you're creating 2 ponds or sending 20 people on training course, and your outcomes. So it's really good to include numbers and be ambitious about those, but just be conscious that you might need to report back on those numbers. So don't be too over ambitious, because you might find yourself then having to go back to a funder and saying, oh, actually not this many people benefited, or you might just want to think about not including any that are going to be really difficult to monitor. So if you can't monitor that the 100 people regularly visiting your garden are going to benefit, if you're never going to survey them and ask them those questions, then you might want to think about whether or not you do want to include it as an outcome. Or you could include it, but you'd need to be clear that you wouldn't be able to monitor that if monitoring is something the funder is asking you to do. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's always worth having a bit of a think about how you'll explain what your plans are beyond the funded period of the project, because funders are really generally reluctant to fund something if they think you're going to become reliant on their funding. Funding is usually time limited, and a funder will be keen to understand what plans you've got to continue beyond the funded period. So just as a couple of examples, recruiting and training volunteers who can carry on doing work after the grant is a really good way to show a kind of legacy of the grant. Even if that's only part of a bigger project, if you've then got some kind of legacy with a group of trained volunteers that are going to carry on doing work, then that's really good. Or, you know, is your project one that could generate income in the future? Maybe you need a grant to get you to that point, a bit of initial investment to help you start being in a position to generate income that could then reduce your need for funding in the future. So there's just a few of the types of things to think about that funders might ask those kind of questions. Again, depending on the size and scale of your grant, you might not need to worry about that, what it's for, but always worth being aware of. Spoke a bit about budget earlier, just a bit more detail on developing a project budget. So it's good to think about all the costs your project might incur, and funders will often split how they view costs into revenue costs and capital costs. So by revenue costs, they generally mean direct staff salaries for delivering your specific project, any travel costs, volunteer costs, training, refreshment, travel costs, those kinds of things. By capital, I've called it equipment cost here, but often called capital by funders. They're talking about laptops, mobile phones, could be gardening equipment. If you've got a big project, could be a tractor, I don't know. So just really think through all of the different costs you might incur as part of your project and make sure they're included in your budget. And full cost recovery is something some funders will consider, but not all. So again, it's just worth checking. But if they will, full cost recovery refers to your proportion of management costs and organisational running costs that will go towards your project. So you might have a project member of staff who's specifically focused on the project, but then their line manager might spend some of their time supporting that person to run that project. So you put a proportion of the line manager's time against the project. I won't try and describe that in any detail because it is a little bit complicated, but there's some really good guidance on the National Lottery Community Fund website. And there are lots of templates that can help you to work out those cost and proportions. So if that is something you're looking at as part of your funding and the funder you're applying to will let you do that, then it's really worth having a look through that. And also just worth bearing in mind that depending on the funder and what size of grant you're going for, you might need to get quotes for equipment or quotes for any contracted work. So, and sometimes you need to do that in advance of applying. Sometimes you can do it after you've applied, but worth being aware that you're likely to have to evidence that. So match funding, again, some funders require match funding, others don't require match funding. It all depends on the size of your grant. And I think as a general rule, no two funders are really the same. So every time you have to check the criteria and the guidance and see what they will fund and what they won't fund. But if a funder does require match funding, you'll either need to have this in place before you apply, or you will need to show that you've got a credible plan for how you're going to secure your match funding towards the project. Match funding is generally broken down into cash contributions, which could be money from your organisation's reserves, could be donations from other people or your community fundraising, or it could be other grants. So they will be direct cash inputs towards your project. Non-cash contributions can include anything like room hire or equipment that you are being given free of charge towards your project. And some funders will be quite happy for you to show those as part of your match funding. And a key one really is volunteer time. And I think for your community projects, you'll probably be able to show quite a lot of volunteer support and volunteer time for your projects. So I've put in here the standard rates used by the National Lottery, the National Lottery Heritage Fund have standard rates for volunteer time. So if you're using a professional volunteer, you can account for that at £50 an hour. For a skilled volunteer, £20 an hour. And for other volunteer roles or admin work, it would be £10 an hour. And I would say, obviously, if you need to show match funding, then volunteer time is a great way to do that if that's allowed. But also, even if you don't need match funding, I think it's a really good idea to include that in your budget if you have got volunteer time, because it's another really great way to show community support for your project. So, if you've been successful in applying for a grant, well done, great work, good show. But it's really, really important that you say thank you to your donors. I've included a lovely picture of Russell from our fundraising team here collecting a cheque from Waitrose, which is brilliant. So, but it's really important that you keep your funders up to date on your progress, and that you follow any guidelines they've given you on reporting or what kind of publicity they might want in return for their grant. So some funders will ask you to report every 6 months or once a year or just at the end of your project. Again, depends on the funder and the size of your project and how long it's lasting. So make sure you do submit those reports on time. And again, some funders will be really keen to have publicity, but there are some who would rather not have publicity. So again, just check with your funder if they do want you to publicise their grant, or if they'd rather stay anonymous, because you don't want to start publicising it and upset your funder if they want to keep it anonymous. I would say if there are any significant changes to your project, you should always tell the funder. And particularly if there are challenges or things aren't going to plan, it's really, really important that you let your funder know. It can seem a little bit daunting, but actually funders are keen to help and they would rather know what's happening, and then they might actually be able to find a way to help support you through the challenges. Funders are often really flexible in that kind of situation as well. So you might be a bit scared that they're going to want their funding back, but it's really rare for a funder to ask for their money back. And they might actually extend their grant period for you, for example, if your project has been delayed, or they might be able to offer a bit of additional funding if something's happened that you weren't expecting. So please, please, please always talk to your funder and make sure you tell them what's going on. Check how your funder wants to keep in touch with you and how often. So again, you might have specific reporting procedures or things they've requested, but do they want to be kept in touch in other ways? Or even beyond your funded grant period, are they still happy to receive a newsletter from you, for example? So it could be a really good way to keep in touch once the formality of the grant period is finished. So good stewardship is really, really important, as you would expect, and it could open the door to further funding in the future. And another thing I would say is that quite often funders talk to each other, so they might share their experiences of supporting your organisation. So if you've been really good at reporting on time, sending in information that they've requested, then they'll have a really positive view of you, and they might share that with other funders. And they often might find out about other funding opportunities come up, and they might be able to point you in the direction of some other funding. So always keep your funders on side. So I think this is my final slide for this evening. So I hope some of that has been interesting to you. I just wanted to remind you to keep an eye out for the Wilder Communities newsletters and the funding opportunities shared in those. And also just highlight that we might be able to provide you with a supporting letter for your project. So if that's of interest, do get in touch with the Wilder Communities team, and they'll try and support that if they can. So thank you for listening. And as Katie mentioned at the start, we'll take questions after Ian's presentation has finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That was really great, actually. Good reminder for me. And yeah, definitely outputs and outcomes, always a confusing one. So yeah, that was really, really useful, actually, to get clarification on that. So yeah, loads of great tips in there, Amanda. Thank you so much. Ian, we're going to go to Ian now, who is part of Friends of Shillingford Woods. And basically, he's going to share his experience of the community coming together to buy a woodland in their community. I'm going to just share my screen. But Ian, it's really over to you.
Okay, right. Thank you, Katie. Yes, hello. My name is Ian Merritt, and I live in Shillingford, St George, just outside Alphington, Exeter. I've been a volunteer with DWT for many years, from bramble bashing to helping at wildlife events. But the last 4 years, I haven't undertaken much volunteering, as I've been involved, along with the local community, on the purchase of our local woodlands, which is Shillingford Wood. It's in the background of the picture there, and they're us lot in the foreground there. Shillingford Wood is about 12 acres on the hill behind the village, and had, by kind permission of the owners, been open for many years for the public to enjoy. But then about 4 years ago, the owners, two local farmers, decided to sell the wood, and hoping it would remain open to the public, they offered to sell it to the local parish council. A number of local residents, including myself, lobbied the council to buy the wood because they could use a very cheap, very long-term loan arrangement with the government, whereby parish councils can buy public amenities very, very cheaply. However, the council were worried about the management of the wood, and after some months of deliberation, turned the offer down. The lobby group considered setting up a project group to raise the money to buy the wood, so it would remain open to the public and could be managed in a wildlife-friendly way. An approach to the vendors fortunately met with a very sympathetic, supportive comments. There was a keen private buyer for the woods, who we also went and saw and discussed with him, and he kindly agreed to stand aside and give us the chance to buy the community to buy the wood, which was great. The cost of the woodland was £65,000, and we added another £5,000 onto that to cover possible expenses. So we needed at least £70,000. We decided, I don't know why, but we decided to go ahead and try and do it. I think at this point it's worth considering the composition of the project group itself. Perhaps other people are members of an established group and you know each other well and how you work together, but perhaps you're a group like we were. We ended up with 9 members of the local community. We were unelected, but somehow just evolved. I knew one of the other 9. I knew 3 slightly, and I'd never met 4 of them. And we're all in much the same position. And none of us had any experience of fundraising or managing woodland. For such a group to set about our task would take a lot of patience and mutual understanding. And I think at this stage, it's worth looking at the theory you might have heard of called forming, storming, norming, performing. This suggests that a new group goes through these 4 stages. In fact, it needs to go through these 4 stages in order to succeed. I was chair, well, I'm chair now, I was chair at the time, and I got very disappointed for a time because meetings seemed to go on forever and never actually achieve anything. And I really felt perhaps it was my fault. But if you go through this forming, storming, norming, performing theory, in fact, it's quite natural for a group to have a sort of awkward birth in a way. And if you get through it, you'll end up with a good group. So anyway, so back to the funding, but not quite. First of all, we had to become some form of legal group. Obviously, if you're the Devon Wildlife Trust, you don't worry about this. You exist, you've been there for years and everyone knows you. We, like a new group, had no status whatsoever. So we had to become some sort of legal entity, I think is the term, and have legal status, and also decide whether or not we should become a registered charity. Being a registered charity would give us credibility and allow us to claim gift aid, of course. All sorts of societies, limited liabilities, companies, all sorts of legal status you can go for. But we took advice from the Teignbridge Volunteer Bureau and ended up applying to become a CIO, if I can say this, a charitable incorporated organization. This is ideal for a small project that doesn't actually really trade. The application to become a CIO can be made in conjunction with the application to become a registered charity, which is sort of quite convenient. And we went ahead. It's worth mentioning here that plenty of people told us, and I'm sure would tell you, that applications to the Charity Commission, National Lottery, etc., take ages, need special knowledge. These people aren't interested in little projects in Devon, etc. In fact, this has always proved to be quite wrong. And in this case, with the Charity Commission, we applied to be a registered charity. We are appointed an officer to help us through the process. And yes, it took a while, but we became a CIO. And understandably, the Charity Commission has to be very careful that the due process is followed. Our project team now became a board of trustees, and we had now met often enough to know each other, our strengths and particular interests, and we could delegate particular tasks to particular trustees now. We're now at last in a position actually to start fundraising, so we opened a bank account. There are, as you've seen already this evening, there are umpteen sources of funds: private donations, councils, lotteries, landfill tax, selling goods such as calendars, running events such as a garden party. And all I can say is you want to try them all. Also many forms of publicity, and you'll need lots of publicity to get the community behind you. Facebook, local newsletters, local press, internet, leaflets, posters, local TV. I'm sure you're going to add to that. And again, it's a question of trying them all. And we came to the conclusion when you try things, we tried to be as professional as we could. We thought we're asking people to give us money, perhaps a lot of money, and they'd have to see us as a really serious go-ahead group. Being sort of enthusiastic amateurs doesn't really count much these days. And we even ended up with a logo and a corporate sweatshirt, so how's that? Once we started fundraising, I think I'd have to say our progress was one of sort of delightful surprise, really. We had some amazing private donations, one up to £10,000. A local resident offered to produce a calendar for us, which I'll show you a sample right in a moment, using images of the wood taken by local people. It sold 280 copies. After we only started, we thought, will we manage to sell 50? We sold 280, and we made well over £1,000 profit. A local resident produced a wonderful video for us that we put on the internet, and that really made us look good. A surveyor undertook work for us and refused to take payment. We rather lost heart with a leaflet that we'd published because nothing seemed to happen. And then one day a lady rang up from another village and said she picked up one of our leaflets in her community shop and she'd like to give us £1,000. So thank you. We ran a garden party, which was a complete sellout and raised over £600. And our local councillors donated 3,500 from their locality budgets. So our experience of fundraising was very sort of positive. On the formal funding side, we applied to Viridor, we know their landfill tax, the National Lottery Green Recovery Fund, and the Postcode Lottery. We received £20,000 from Viridor, £10,000 from the Postcode Lottery, but our bid to the Recovery Fund failed as we were unable to prove we would create employment. But we adapted the application to a National Lottery Heritage Fund application, and we won £17,000, which, as already been mentioned earlier, fortunately included an element of equipment and tools and things, bird boxes, bat boxes, which we are now installing in the woods. And I have to say that, and this has already been said, that it was our experience that the funders were really very helpful, all of them. And never be afraid to ring up with a silly question. They always seem to be really on our side. And I say, don't believe people who tell you, oh, it won't work. No, people don't do this sort of thing. Don't believe it. Funders, well, I suppose the way they have to lend money, so they need us as well. Devon Wildlife Trust helped us. For example, they wrote for us a professional view of our wood, and it turned out to be absolute gold. It was beautifully done, and we sent to all the funders, and we used it time and time again. It also always seemed to work. So overall, we had become a registered charity on the 23rd of November 2020, and on the 23rd of September 2021, we felt confident enough in the money we'd raised to instruct our solicitors to start the purchase process. And we took possession of the wood in February 2022. Since then, we have held 3 wildlife events in the wood, a dawn chorus, a moth hunt, and a bat walk. We've held 2 volunteer work days and have an application with the Forestry Commission for £1,000 so we can get a professional woodland management plan written for us. We held another sell-out garden party this year. It's actually becoming part of the local social year, I think, and we are planning activities for next year. I think that's most of what I have. Okay, oh yes, and also I think it's worth mentioning that we had a really very pleasant, although we are up the wood, we had a very pleasant surprise. We thought we'd hold a thank you party in the village hall, and we offered, it was free, cream teas, and we were absolutely astounded. The place was packed. The sort of enthusiasm that people have for wildlife is quite amazing. And if you really can harness that, people will back you with a bit of money, just support, just being sort of buying a calendar, whatever it is. So it's been altogether a really positive experience, all this fundraising. And so here we are now. I think the tips I would give, I suppose, in a way, is I think you want to keep sort of a high profile of your project. People, you launch it, people talk about it, but you've got to keep on with newsletters or whatever to make sure people know you are progressing and you are doing what you said you would do. And if they give you any money, it will be used. Another point, it may vary, but we found it was important to keep the vendors on our side. I mean, they were very kind. They said they'd wait for their money. They didn't say how long, but they said they'd wait. So it seemed quite right that we just kept in touch with them, told them what we were doing, and I think that probably paid off in the end. We've now got a very good fundraising didn't stop once we bought the wood. In fact, we've gone on, and we now have quite a nice little financial reserve. And actually, we are ready, should any land come up for sale around us, we feel quite confident we will raise the money to buy it to expand the wood. We have produced our next year's calendar. Here we are, a mere £10, all proceeds to Shillingford Wood. I just say we now currently hold quarterly trustees meetings. We're lucky there's a trustee who has a Swedish wooden hut in his back garden where we can sit and toast marshmallows and drink wine during the meetings, which are always very well attended, as you can imagine. And the project's actually been enjoyable and very positive, and for the community, I think it's been absolutely great. So that's if anyone's thinking of trying to raise money, please do so. It's quite an enjoyable thing to do. So, well, anyway, thank you for listening to me. I hope it's helped, and good luck with any projects you might have.
Thanks so much, Ian. That was really inspiring. And it just goes to show that, when a group of people come together and, just want to do one thing together, by the woodland, it's amazing what you can do as a group together, So yeah, really, really great stuff. I feel inspired. Thank you so much, Ian. We're going to have, just very quickly before the questions, and I hope you've been putting questions in the chat, we're just going to have a very quick poll. I'll just put that up now. There we go. So after, our two speakers tonight, we just wanted to know, do you now feel, more inspired, more able or confident to apply for a funding grant? Please be honest. I'll just allow that for a moment to come through. So quite a few of you are now saying you now feel a lot more inspired and able, confident to apply, which is great. Some people feel a little more, and none of you feel not sure or do not feel more inspired. So that is really, really positive. Yeah, hopefully, you'll after this you'll go on to start applying, or just doing, community fundraising in your community, whether it be garden tea parties, which I want to come along to next year, Ian, or whatever it may be. I'll just quickly share the results. There we go. Right, so over to you really now. If you've got any questions, Hetty, do we have any questions that have come through?
We sure do. So let's have a look. First question is for you, Ian. So do you have a website to find events and come and see the woods?
We do have a website. I can't say it's up to date with our events on it. I do visit it, but I think actually I'm not the person that deals with this. I don't understand it. We rely very much on Facebook. We have, I think, several hundred Facebook followers now, and we do put on things, anything that's happening or report about that evening or whatever. So I think we're actually probably using Facebook rather than the internet at the moment. But we still have a presence on the internet. And so, certainly, I mean, I say I don't know much about social media, but it was certainly very powerful. No two ways about it. You've got to use social media when you're fundraising and getting support.
Yeah, and certainly I concur, that all the communities that we talk to or groups, it's the way they communicate is through Facebook. It's a really good way to reach lots of people, isn't it, Ian? So yeah, that's a good one.
Great tip, thank you. Next question for Amanda. So is there a knack to applying for staff fees? I recently received funding for a project which admin and coordination was by far the biggest need, but I could only apply for staff fees as a small percentage of the overall grant. Because other costs weren't particularly high and the grant was fairly modest, this meant we could only cover a small number of staff hours, much less than is actually needed. So do you have any advice for that, Amanda?
Yeah, I think that's sadly a very common challenge, and it is challenging even for Devon Wildlife Trust to cover the staff costs of a project. So I think, I mean, it does depend on the funder. Some funders are more willing to fund staff costs than others. So yeah, I would go out and see if you can just keep building relationships with anyone who is funding your project and see if they might be open to funding staff costs. But also, you know, the other kind of fundraising activities are really valuable in that sense, because if you are able to raise money from community fundraising sources or individual donations that are unrestricted, then those can be really useful to help you cover your staff costs. So yeah, I'm afraid there's no magic answer in that case, but just yeah, keep looking for funding opportunities, and wherever you can try and get unrestricted funding in to help cover your staff costs.
Great, thank you. Next question, probably for you again, Amanda, is do we need to be registered as a charity or CIC, or perhaps even CIO, to apply for a grant, and kind of what are the sort of differences?
Sure. Okay, so again, it really varies by funder. So I think it probably depends a bit on the scale of funding you're looking to raise. I think there are some funders who will support small community groups and community activities without you needing to be a registered charity. You probably would still need to set up some kind of constitution though, and a bank account in your organisation's name. I think there are definitely some advantages to being a registered charity. As Ian said, it does give your organisation credibility. It means you're able to claim gift aid on your donations, and it does open up certainly more grant opportunities, because quite a few funders would only support if you're a registered charity. But it does come with the additional admin of having to set up your charity in the first place, set up your trustee board, and holding your trustee meetings and doing your annual reporting to the Charity Commission. And just very briefly on a CIC, I think that's a community interest company. So that can be a route for community groups to go down if you're expecting to be an income generating project. So if you're looking to set up a community cafe or something where you're going to have regular income for your project that will cover most of your costs, that can be a good route to go down. A community interest company is effectively more like a business where you're bringing in your own income, but then you're using that income to go towards your charitable purpose. I would say grant funding opportunities are a lot slimmer for community interest companies. Some funders are now increasingly open to considering that, and certainly some of the more large-scale funders like the lottery would consider a community interest company, but a lot of other grant funders wouldn't give grant support. So it really depends on your size of your organisation and what you're aiming to achieve. I would really recommend, I think Ian said they spoke to their local council voluntary services. So if you have one in your area, well, you should have one in your area, I would contact them and see if they can offer some advice. Really is important to get that set up right at the start so that it'll meet your needs, because it will make things easier further down the line.
Advice. There's a couple of questions here for you, Ian, quite similar ones. So to kind of pull them into one question, I guess, how did you manage to get so many people in your community involved? And then there's sort of another part to the question, which is just about what methods you use to, I suppose, reach out and engage your community. Obviously, you had such great success.
I think we did everything we could. We have a very good local sort of parish newsletter. We started with that. We used Facebook very much. I mean, we always laugh about it, but we used the dog lobby. Dog walkers are great people, and I'm one, I will say. And it was amazing, actually, just talking to dog walkers about this project, how they seem to support it and tell people about it. And I know that might seem almost a silly thing to say, but don't ignore the dog lobby. They're quite a chatty group of people. And we had events as well. I mean, you've got to involve the community. So we had a garden party. We held a couple of meetings, which surprisingly people turned up at. I think and Facebook, which I mentioned, there's no one thing with communication. I think there are so many means of communication now. You've just got to go for all of them. And I suppose these things gain a certain amount of momentum of their own. We got the campaign going. It became sort of, I think, so well known in a way in the area that it more or less kept itself going. People are actually asking us how it was going and how could they help. So I think that's all I can say. You sort of press every button when it comes to publicity.
Great. Next question, perhaps back to you, Amanda. If costs changed for equipment or anything else, perhaps some equipment that you had donated, maybe there were some requests for funds in the grants, but maybe you had some donated. The question is around, are funders generally happy if you reallocate funding to something else within the project?
Yes, I would say so. I'd say again, it's just really key that you speak to the funder and ask them first. So yeah, I wouldn't reallocate things within the budget and then tell them afterwards when you're reporting back. I would pick up the phone to them, just let them know what's happened. They'll be delighted that your project's getting other support. And as I said, in my experience, it's very rare for a funder to ever ask for the funds back. So as long as you're reallocating it within, you know, some other area that kind of fits within their guidelines as much as possible, I'd say they're normally really flexible. You know, they want to help and support, and they've already committed that funding. So yeah, usually just have that conversation with them, and normally they'd be happy.
Great. Let's see, I think we've got a couple more questions to go. One for you, Katie, actually. Are the Wilder Communities team able to offer advice and support during a funding application? So I know Amanda's mentioned that we can offer letters of support, but I guess with the actual application process itself, what do you think about that?
I don't see why not. I mean, you know, we're happy to look over applications, you know, before they're sent off, because I just think, you know, any help, and like Amanda said, you know, to get another eye, you know, pair of eyes on it, can really help. So yeah, before the application, during, after, you know, we're here for it all. So yeah, happy to look at applications. Yeah.
Brilliant. And then last question of the evening, back to you, Amanda. Do you have any recommendations or kind of examples for funders that people can start having a look at in Devon that might be relevant?
Well, I think the first place to look would be the Wilder Communities page of funding opportunities, if you haven't looked at that already. And then once the slides and recording of this gets shared, I would go back and look at the list of funding bulletins that you could perhaps sign up to, so that you're getting information first on funding opportunities. But yeah, I think we do try and capture those that we think are going to be most relevant to community groups like yours, and put them on the Wilder Communities page. So our team are always looking for funding opportunities for Devon Wildlife Trust, but whenever we see anything we think might be suitable for the community groups, we do flag that to Katie and Hetty. So yeah, that's your first port of call really in terms of grants.
Fantastic. That's all the questions I can see at the moment. Hope I haven't missed any, but if you do think of anything after the session, you're always welcome to email us, and we're happy to answer those for you. So back to you, Katie.
Thank you. And yeah, just to say, we've got the web page with the funding opportunities on there, but it's also worth just signing up to our e-news, because that's a nice reminder to go and have a look at the web page. And we also share stories, community stories, which could include things like, you know, communities getting funding, or just getting inspiration about what communities are doing project wise, where they live. So I do recommend signing up to our e-news. You can find that on the Wilder Communities webpage at devonwildlifetrust.org, on our website. And if, yeah, like Hetty said, if you've got any more questions, or if you've got a funding application you want to send us to have a look at, then you know we're all ears. We're here for you, and yeah, we'll help in any way we can. Thank you so much to Amanda and Ian. I found that really useful, interesting and inspiring. I hope you did too. But yeah, thank you very much. The next webinar will be January, I think it's the 26th. And that will be around burial grounds and churchyards and how you can improve those for wildlife. And that's with David Curry from Exeter Diocese. So that will be a really good one to come along to too. So yeah, thank you everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks everyone. I've just popped a link in the chat as well if anyone wants to provide any feedback for the session, then we're really happy to hear that too.
Yes, please do give your feedback so we can go on doing these and do them better and better every time.